Welcome to the South by Southwest panel about the Metaverse and how it can rebuild society, but better. And so I'm Addie Robertson. I'm the senior reporter at The Verge, and I'm here with Taj Reid, who is the Global Chief Experience Officer at Edelman. I have...
I'll take it.
That's good. I like it.
Nice. I have Aletha Parker-Wood, who is the Principal Privacy Engineer at Amazon Web Services, and I have Darren Shou, who is the CTO of NortonLifeLock. And so we're all going to talk about the Metaverse, and the first thing we're going to talk about is what the Metaverse actually is. So I just want each of you to say, when you say the word metaverse, what do you mean? And also, why do you think that's an important term to use?
Awesome. I can start.
Yeah.
Thanks, Addie. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I'm having a little bit of an out-of-body experience because I feel like I've been staring at little squares on a laptop, and now I'm actually seeing people. So just thanks so much. It's a little I'm gonna embrace my inner awkward and just if I see you and we talk later, a fist bump, a handshake, maybe a hug. But so happy that you all are here. And it's pretty ironic that we're talking about the metaverse when we're actually having this shared experience together in this physical space. So when I think of the metaverse, I've been thinking about it from a very directional standpoint. The metaverse has been around, the concept of it has been around for so long, but this idea of being in a 3D persistent environment where there's objects you can interact with, having an avatar, thinking about your identity, and being able to have that shared experience with people is so fascinating. And the touch points for that, whether it be goggles or through your phone, I think it's something that we can all think about, and that direction is what is so exciting for the future. So what do you think, Aletha?
Yeah. I'm coming at the metaverse from a very different lens. My background is mostly in security, privacy, anti-abuse. I've been doing that for the last decade at places like Symantec with Darren, AWS more recently. So when I think about the metaverse, I think about things like, what does it actually mean to have digital ownership of goods on the blockchain? What does that mean from a security and privacy perspective? When you have virtual reality, how do you know that what you're seeing is an authentic representation? How do you know that you're seeing the same thing everybody else is seeing? How do you prevent people from doing abusive things in the metaverse? Especially as we get to higher fidelity virtual reality, that becomes more and more difficult for somebody to experience, much like in the real world. So that's kind of how I think about the metaverse. It's about virtual reality, shared experiences. It's about things like blockchain enabling ownership of goods. And it's really a remix of technologies that have been around for a while. But I think putting them together in the right ways has amazing potentials.
So it's great to see everybody. I have to say that. I know it's been said many times in person. When I think about the metaverse, and I think about why we're all here today and why we have this interest in it and why do we have to name it and describe it, I think it's important to do so because we want to figure out what have we learned from the technologies that we've used in the past. How can we avoid some of the pitfalls that we've seen in those technologies? Let's look at what might be different or even better or opportunistic about what happens in the metaverse. And how can we, artfully craft it? So for me, it's not so much about, is it naming it? Is it here yet? Is it not here yet? Arguing about, it's around the corner or it's not going to happen, it's going to happen. It's really about how artfully we as a group, and that's why I'm so excited to be here, with all the creators at South by, can get together and think about from the experience, whether it's the haptics, whether it's the technology, whether it's the music involved in the experience, weaving all of that together in something that we're not just participating in kind of passively, but that we're living in it, I think is so important. And Aletha and I were having some coffee early this morning. Do you mind if I use some of your words here?
Go right ahead.
And we were having this conversation. She said, Darren, and she structured it so beautifully. She's like, there's this notion of being descriptive about it or being prescriptive about it. And we can describe what the metaverse is, but we have to be careful, and I want to get this right, and then please correct me if I get it not exactly right. We got to be careful about bounding ourselves too much in the prescription of what it is, and instead focus about what it could be. Did I capture that about right, or maybe you can kind of dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to look at where we're at today. I'm very much a realist, but I think it's also important to look at what's possible and what we want to be true about the metaverse. We can say all sorts of things about what types of security, privacy, intuition we can build in the metaverse today, but that doesn't have to be the end state of the metaverse. I think it's really important to think about what is and is not possible. What are the physical limits of the technology that we have, and what do we want it to be able to do for us? What are the experiences we want to enable? How do we want to help people be their best selves? Because at the end of the day, technology is about people. All of the problems that come up in the metaverse are the same problems people have been causing for each other for the last many millennia. So how do we make it easy to be a good human being and difficult to be a bad one?
Can I add on to that, though, and agree with you? But all the opportunities that we've had, too, with technology are also the opportunities that we can maybe amplify and think about. I like to think about the metaverse as maybe being able to put more fuel on the fire, and that fire in a goodness sense. What can we do to create more empathy? What can we do to create more inclusion? How can we have better equity through the designs and the actions and the thoughts that we take today? I see, Taj, maybe you're nodding your head, or Addie.
Oh, I was going to say, so NortonLifeLock conducted a survey about the specific thing I want to ask, which is why should anyone want to use the metaverse? What do people actually want to do? Why should anyone care?
Right, so maybe I'll take that and then toss it back over to you guys. So we surveyed some folks about the metaverse, and the first question that was really surprising to me in the answers was how many people really understand what the metaverse is or are interested in it. And it turns out that 2 out of 3 US adults surveyed about it were not familiar with the term or not really familiar with what it meant to them. But when asked about what they want to do in the metaverse, and this was interesting, even you have to be careful when you construct surveys because you want to be too leading in the answers that you're giving. And so we want to have some room for that. Do they want to shop? Is the metaverse an economy? Do they want to transact? Is it more personal? And it turns out that the majority of respondents overwhelmingly said they want to do things in the metaverse that they couldn't do in the real world. And I think that almost gets back to your original question of what is it? And if it's determined by intentions and desires, it can largely be the encapsulation of our humanity's intentions to do things that we can't do today. What does that mean? Does it mean that we're flying? Does it mean that I'm in a nursing home when I'm 80 years old and I'm able to go scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef, even though I'm confined to my room? There's so many wonderful experiences that we can enable. I think that's the beauty of this. That's what I get really excited about.
Darren, I love how you touched on that in terms of like the superpowers that the metaverse may be able to enable, but also just this idea of creative expression and connection, like that idea of empathy, the idea of how do we create systems and accessibility where everyone's perspective and voice can be heard and they can express that at the highest level. I think the metaverse offers us opportunities that we may not be able to realize in the real world. So like I hear that. There's one other thing. I saw this stat that's super interesting. I have 3 kids, and my daughter Stella is 11, and it was like 3 out of 5 kids are now asking for their allowance via like digital currency. You know, whether it be in like, oh, I see some nodding heads, and that is true to life. Like my whole household is asking for that, and so like.
But you mow the lawn and you get like $2, but then later on in the afternoon it's $18,
just
and then it's like
chores,
16 cents.
doing well in school, just like, can I get that Roblox skin? But like, I say all that to be like, the idea of the metaverse and it being directional and superpowers and being able to express yourself, like, it's a current, it's a wave that's going, and I'm just really excited to think about how we could harness that wave.
Yeah, actually, one of the things you had mentioned was kind of making this more accessible than, say, there are real shortcomings with being able to access the internet today and platforms. What are the things that you think people should be thinking about right now with the metaverse?
So, you know, from my perspective of kind of being an experienced designer and thinking about like what's the invitation, the engagement, the reward, the sustainability of it all, I think it's so important that we build systems that are open, like open standards. When we think about the objects that go into the metaverse, well, be GLTF and others, like are there areas and opportunities for lots of people to participate and build these worlds and be able to have the thing that they construct and take it across platform, across worlds in a compelling way? But Aletha, I know you would say this, like, how do we also assign credit and make sure that what they're seeing or what they're making is true?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important in the metaverse. We see this online today. You see people taking things, claiming as their own. I think there's a lot of potential in the metaverse to start to build intuitions. This is the aspect of the metaverse that I'm really excited about, because I feel like security and privacy are challenged today because people just have really bad intuitions about who can see what they're doing, what's happening, and where information is coming from. So I love that the metaverse gives us this very human-sized space and gives us these opportunities to start to build those intuitions to help us think about who is seeing our data, where did this come from, what's the provenance of it, does it have some information attached to it so I can go learn that this piece of art was made by, a woman in Jamaica and this piece of art was made by someone in the Ukraine. Where is your stuff coming from? What is that chain of ownership? And how do we help people to understand what's happening in a way that really connects with them as opposed to this very sterile text-based interface that is the norm today?
Actually, attribution raises an interesting question, which is, does that mean that you have to have an attestable, verifiable identity in this virtual world? Or is there still going to be room to be anonymous or to not tie your presence there to your real identity?
That's actually something, if you don't mind, I'll feel
Yeah,
this
no,
one, because
I would
have
love to talk about it. So,
very strong feelings about this.
well, as a young teenager getting online early on like bulletin boards and everything, there was this wonderful concept of anonymity. But as I started getting into technology, I realized it was more about being pseudonymous, right? And through time and space. Because as I started seeing what was being, the commerce part of the internet, it really became apparent that I was not only being observed online, right? The average person encounters up to like 177 trackers in their first week online, right? And so if you have that many people observing you, you start to behave differently. And so I think about that in the metaverse too, right? We are going to be observed. It's going to have some commercial aspects in some parts of the metaverse, right? If we have a multiverse of metaverses. And as we start thinking about the identity, I'd like to hope that we can have different facets of the identity. Just as I have a bit of a work persona, and then I have a bit of a social persona and a family persona, I think we all want to have the ability to, project certain aspects of ourselves when we're traveling in the real world and when we're traveling in the metaverse. And I think we can do that in a way that allows us to have attribution, allows us to share reality with people and have trust between parties, but also allows us to express who we are in different contexts. I think that's one of the great things about it, right? If I want to be in one world and doing something with one place, I might want to represent myself an entirely different way than another, but have it all tie back and be accountable to that, I suppose.
Accountability is the key word there. I think one of the challenges that we see online today is that there are people who, for very good reasons, do want to be able to do things that are not tied to their identity. You have LGBTQ teens online trying to figure out how to navigate that in a way that doesn't bring consequences back to them. I actually think there was a really interesting case that came up in the last couple of weeks about a Chechnyan general who had gone and carefully hunted down everyone that he could find who was publicly LGBTQ. There are a lot of reasons why people value that anonymity. But also, you want to make sure that you're not opening the door to malicious behavior. So I think of identity, we treat identity as if it's a singular thing, but what we really care about is the attributes of that person. Are you someone who is authorized to buy this? Are you someone who is trustworthy to pass on this information? That's actually not so much about your identity. It's about what attributes you carry.
Yeah, I mean, if I want to see a doctor in the metaverse, I want to make sure that they are, and maybe you want to make sure that they're actually a doctor. And so that's an attribute. It's just part of that, right? And maybe we can create new constructs for that. I mean, imagine that's something I would like to look at using blockchain for, in a way of how can I attest to certain attributes I have to me and then call upon them when needed, but have a root of trust so that people can check those where it's necessary. That might be one way of doing it.
Yeah, and that's a place where I think emerging technology is doing some really cool stuff. And Taj, I would love to hear your take on it too.
Just one piece on that.
How do we actually design it and build it? Right?
No, I think it's so fascinating. Why I love being at talks like this is because if we're able to crack the code on identity and how it's attached to an individual and how they can verify, then the historical relevance moving forward can be just exponential. Like, I watched today just like creative expression and cultural impact moments that are spreading across the internet like wildfire. And you think about the lineage and the attribution to the creator of that. What does that look like as we move forward in the metaverse, where now history doesn't lose that fact? Like, we're able to really see where did this idea start from? For instance, my wife teases me, I swear I started this trend where you put the one strap of your backpack over your shoulder. I want credit for that, but no one will give it to me. But being able to get these little moments, whether it be really big kind of political topics and issues all the way to fashion, to creative expression. I think there's something so magical about what the promise of the metaverse can bring and how we can attach that attribution.
Can I say one more thing?
Okay.
Just really riffing off his point, Addie. Some people describe the metaverse as kind of the combination of gaming and crypto. So like, why now, after all these years of the term? And when you're just talking about identity and attribution, one of the things that really strikes me is how the NFT marketplace is really enabling creators to take part in the appreciation, in both senses of the word, the appreciation of their work, but also the appreciation and the valuation of the work over time. And so if you think about whether it's a piece of art, a piece of music, something you've created in the metaverse, and every time that transacts, there is the possibility for that smart contract then to help benefit the identity, whether it's anonymous or pseudonymous, of the person that created it, right? And so it's a whole different thing that really, the decentralization of the NFTs, for me, really focuses back on the people that are creating it.
Yeah.
We can all be creators in the metaverse.
The thing about NFTs, though, is that in theory, they're supposed to enable this trustless system, the system where the tech takes care of everything and can, like, make sure you know who you're buying from. That hasn't actually happened. The NFTs are a huge, it's full of scams right now. I think even people who like them will admit that. And a lot of these trust systems have just meant that you have these agents that are doing things and you have no idea who they are and you have no idea whether they're actually trustworthy. So who controls all these things? Who makes sure that the doctor you're visiting in the metaverse is actually a licensed practitioner?
Yeah, and also before we get there, I want to loop back to something you asked earlier about accessibility and fairness on the internet, because I think this ties very much into...
I think you might want to, I think the mic is might wanna be a little
sorry.
closer.
We can hear you better then.
Excellent. So what I was saying was I actually want to loop this back around to the question of accessibility and fairness, because one of the things that we're seeing in the NFT space is this colonization of art, because it's first to claim rather than first to create. So because your wife did not get that attestation the first time she wore her backpack, she will never be able to claim it because someone else has. And as long as the people who are early adopters who early adopters usually are, and I'm guessing if you're in this room, you're probably in that crowd, you're not necessarily going to look like the rest of the world. You're not going to look like the people who are creating this art. And so we have these challenges where we need to make sure that we are being fair and inclusive. We're giving credit as things come into the blockchain or otherwise. We need to make sure that people have access, and we need to talk about how that happens to be able to start to create in this digital world, because otherwise the world that we create is going to look like the world we always create.
Could I jump in on you mentioned the term, if I heard it right, trustless. And that's something that almost can be like, it triggers an emotion in me of, is it really trustless, or are we just shifting where we place trust in? Are we placing trust today in mostly centralized authorities, right? Whether it's a bank or a professional organization, or are we wanting to choose to place trust in decentralized, right? That I can ask Aletha for a recommendation and she can ask Taj what his recommendation, it comes back to me. I think these are some things, but there's this concept of an oracle. I don't think we get a trustless system. I think we look and create options for different ways to find trust. And I use the word, and I've heard many other people use the word trust anchors. What is that anchor in the metaverse for that? Whether it's an identity or whether it's something more conceptual. For example, I see some people taking photos and everything, and that's great. In the metaverse, can you guarantee that the person who takes a photo over there and a person who takes the photo over there have the same photo? In a really personalized, hyper-personalized world, they are looking at the same thing, but do they see the same thing? Moreover, it's more than just seeing, are they experiencing the same thing? That whole notion of that all ties back into trust. What do I have trust in? Can I trust even that my experience is the same as someone else's? And all of those things, I think, will require some sort of oracle or something for us to design. I don't have the answer. This is something I think all of us want to engage in conversation is. So if you're designing in the space, if you're an artist, if you're a musician, if you're creating one of these worlds, how can you create kind of touch points where everybody has that same foundational thing, right? That they can have faith in something. What are those oracles? What are those systems? Or maybe we invent new systems other than oracles.
Yeah, Taj, actually, I'm curious from a design standpoint, how do you tell people this is where you're getting this information, and
Yes.
this is how you decide whether you should trust it, and this is how you make sure, there's also sort of a security aspect. How do you know what you're actually getting here?
You know, I think that is the question to be solved and to answer for, because when I think about design, it goes back to your point, Aletha, about accessibility. Like, who has the right or the opportunity to participate in this world or in this metaverse or in this community and have their voice heard at an equitable standard? So when I think about from a hardware perspective, seeing innovation from, you don't have to have some massive computer. If we can get to a place where your interface can be like a very like low cost interaction with the metaverse, all the way to like this idea of like open standards and the objects and the file formats that we use, everybody has the opportunity to participate. That's where the design, I think, really starts to begin because of the accessibility.
Yeah, and then once they actually have the hardware, like
Right.
let's say we get that low-cost hardware, it's broadly available all over the world, then how do people start to reason about what they're seeing? How do they know that the experience that I'm having in the metaverse, you're sitting right next to me, are you
Right.
seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? How would we know?
Because I think it's so important that there is a large range of perspectives and voices represented when we think about building and designing this world and these systems.
I mean, a lot of the problems that have come up on the internet today have happened in part because of business models, because even if you come in with these ideals, you end up, if you have an advertising system, it enables and sort of incentivizes security or incentivizes surveillance. And there are all these systems where if you paywall something, it might make information more trustworthy, but it cuts off access. So what kind of business models do you think we're going to end up seeing in the metaverse broadly? And what do you think we should try to see? What should we be aiming at?
So one of the things I think is really, and I actually mentioned this earlier, that maybe the metaverse, one definition of it could be it's an economy. And that's only one model. It doesn't have to be. But one of the things that I find interesting about it, and I don't mean it so much in a classical sense, it could really be a reimagined economy. But will there be one metaverse? I don't think so. I'm not sure that it matters. There'll be many different worlds, and I think we're already there in some sense. We've discussed this a little bit. When you're engaging in social media, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or any of these worlds, you're already engaging through a device, probably the phone that you're holding, and you're engaging in a world that's very immersive when you're into it. And there is a whole model around that went from B2C to B2B2C and became this kind of, hey, we're gonna drive this largely off of ads. And then there's this other notion, though, of if I have a multiverse of metaverses, do I not want to have portability of who I am between those worlds? Do I not want to have portability of assets so I can bring things in, whether it's like a skin that we talked about or some cool sneakers that I want to have there? If I'm moving things between there, then there's all these notion, we've already jumped into a world where you have possessions. And I don't know that that's the only world. There could be a concept of the metaverse where there aren't possessions, right? We are in a digital world. Do we have to succumb to that notion where it has to be a commerce world? I don't know that it has to be, especially if we can create things out of thin air. But then Aletha mentioned earlier, you do have physical constraints. And those physical constraints, and we were just talking about hardware, are very real. We have to use some form of energy to operate right now on some whatever. You can go to neuromorphics if you want to, but there's some type of, we would call hardware running some kind of technology stack that's empowering all this. We're going to spend a tremendous amount of energy, right, in terms of moving electrons around or something around that has to power this whole experience. So there are some limitations there when we think about the infrastructure that we might conveniently not want to talk about at this point and just focus on what does it feel like or what is it experience of. But underneath that, there has to be something. And those assets have to exist in the physical world.
Yeah,
Where are they
Tasha.
going to be?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, you've talked a little bit about the purchasing side of the economy, but you haven't talked about the other side of the economy. I think one of the visions of the metaverse, and this was, to be fair, the vision of Web 2 as well, was the idea that it would enable people to be creators, to participate by building new things in the metaverse that were then available for other people to buy. I think that's always been the vision. And it's never worked out because the friction has been so high. You look at things like Second Life, which I think of as the initial prototype for the metaverse. You have this virtual world.
Who remembers Second Life? That was
Second
definitely
Life is
something.
still running.
Like
Second
me.
Life still has a large number of users. I feel like I should be clear about this.
Thank you, Eddie. Eddie, I'm sorry. Anyway, but I think as we move forward, I think the technology for creation is getting easier and easier. One of my daughter's best friends has been using her Oculus Rift to do 3D light paintings, and it's so frictionless for her. It's really easy for her to create. So I love that idea that it gets easier and easier to create content and then to be able to share it freely, to be able to monetize it, to do what you want to do with it in the metaverse. So I think that's
Or to
where
give it away at zero
Yeah.
copy cost. I mean, there could be a whole bunch of things that are accessible to everybody because you
Yeah.
can manifest them very easily.
Roblox
right?
is another great case in point. Roblox is another thing I think of as one of the seeds of where I see the metaverse going, where you've
Taj-
got kids creating and
Yeah.
I was going to say, Taj, to your point about accessibility, do you feel like there's a role here for specifically non-commercial parts or aspects of the metaverse? That if someone's maintaining them, it's not just that you give things away for free, it's that they're not run for profit at all.
Yeah, no, I think there's a complete space for that, and that's one of the areas that I'm most excited about when we think about like how do we have the community, the participation, engagement be like policy ready, data ready, credibility ready, so that folks are entering the space with a complete awareness of what they're participating in, what they may be giving up, what they can hold on to, what is true to their identity. I think there's an entire space for that participation and innovation in terms of what we create going towards the metaverse. And like, you know, I was talking to my dad about this, and in his mind, it was very binary. It was like, we exist in this world and then we jump into the metaverse, and we had this long debate about like, it's much more of an evolution. Like, you know, there could be argued that we are in the metaverse now, like, which is why I'm so excited to be physically together with you all today. Like, it just feels so special. But like, much of my day is spent talking to a screen with multiple people, and the relationships that we've developed there are very much in the digital space. The shared experiences we have are in this digital space. So when I think of that evolution, there's plenty of opportunity, I think, beyond business, but just on this idea of like, how do we empower communities to be policy ready, for them to be like ready about the data and understanding it, but then also to just be like, how do I assign credibility to my identity?
yeah, I would love to see NGOs, governments investing in this space early and
Absolutely.
saying, you know, we want to give you, to your point about trusted attestations, I would love to see NGOs that are those roots of trust that say, we have evaluated this, we know what this is, invest in those spaces so we do have these building blocks to say, we have some notion that people are who they say they are, that this good is owned by
Or
the
that
person.
the attributes are what they say they are.
Or that this attribute,
right?
yes.
To maintain that anonymity
Yes.
that we discussed earlier.
Yes, absolutely.
We have the opportunity to create all of this, right? We're at a stage, we're in it, we're moving towards it. Again, it's not the question of whether it happens, whether it doesn't happen, it's whether we artfully create it the way we want it for us. To your point earlier, are we doing this to create something that's going to be good for us, for future generations? You just talked about your dad, you just talked about your daughter. That is something I get so excited about, is how can we learn from what we've experienced with our devices, like our smartphones, with social media, with all these technologies. The history of technologies are really the history of human progress in many ways, for good or bad. How can we harness the best out of this?
Yeah, what sort of more specifically, if there's a concrete lesson that people should take from how social media developed over the last decade, and we're applying it to, there's overlap between social media and the metaverse, but what should we do? How should we apply that to the new generation of digital spaces?
May I jump in on that real quick? And I think everybody probably wants to riff off that. One of the things that was, kind of goes back to my original story is, I guess the best way to say it is, a couple of years ago, my daughter's 8 now, but when my wife was pregnant with her, and I was starting to do a lot of searches for things like strollers and all the other things, how to be a parent, how to be a good parent, right? Like how to raise a strong daughter. And so all my searches were putting these signals out into the world. And I figured that was going to happen. Of course, all my ads started changing towards selling me stuff related to a kid, which was very beneficial at the time. What was less beneficial is about a year or so after she was born, 2 years after she was born, I'm still getting all these ads for like diapers and things like that, and it's like less relevant to me. So it's not a bad concept. It's about how beneficial it was. What then became interesting, though, is I started getting, when we had our research labs look into it, how much of it was not what I was seeing and how people were seeing my behaviors, how much of it was behind the scenes? Was anybody slowly morphing the world around me? Was anybody changing the experience of my world online, both on social media and elsewhere? It was just really pronounced on social media. And the answer was yes. And so we had to investigate this. We started a project, and we had a code name for it. I thought it was pretty cool, but the idea was, we called it Black Mirror, but the idea was we spun up all these different headless browsers. So imagine having 1,000 virtual machines spun up. In each one of them, every time I searched for something, it would spin up another browser and search for something unrelated to it, and another one, and another one. And the idea is you can kind of think about it like a tree's roots. Starting from the trunk, it just spread and spread and spread out. And then I wanted to know where it ended. Where did those roots end? And there was very different worlds. So we captured all of it visually. And you can imagine after doing this just for a number of hours, but especially over months, you end up in different places. If you start by looking for, baby clothes and things like that, your whole world is being curated around that, versus if I started looking for, like, let's say, a new car, an electronic car. And it's more than you might imagine. It's changing the headlines on the same news articles. It's changing the angles on the pictures during elections for me. I'd have the same picture of an event, but taken from different angles, subtly different, right? And it all changes around me, and I started getting really interested in how much of the change, what big of a gap was it? Because imagine, as we start going on through our lives, if each of us is getting a personalized experience, that can be highly beneficial, as I mentioned. The problem isn't that the world is being curated. The problem that I had with it, was that it was being done invisibly. There was some unseen hand.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what I wanted to know about. Yeah, please, jump in.
No,
Yeah, I was going to say, I have some thoughts, and I want to hear yours.
Yeah, no, and I love that.
Pass the
Darren.
ball, man.
Yeah, that's right, Carl.
Take it.
And Eddie, I love your push on this, because I think, if there's anything that we've learned from where we are today and where we can go in the future, it's really about, like, the intention of the design and getting the widest, like, range of perspectives and ideas at that table leading the design, because these designs have real consequence, positive and negative. And so when I think about the metaverse and what we can do, we have to be, like, really clear, not only about the sobriety of, like, what's happening with the data, the credibility. That's why I loved your push on, like, is there, like, a non-profit business model for this integration? But then also, what are the on-ramps and off-ramps? Like, I want to jump into the metaverse just like everybody in this room, but I also want to know when I should just get out, and maybe, like, enjoy life again. And so, like, the
Right, but unlike a book or anything
Right.
like that, or like your phone today, someone's battery is going to run out.
Yeah.
There's no stopping cue.
Exactly. So these moments, I think, of the design and the intentionality of the design and being really thoughtful and considerate and having as many different perspectives at the table when we're thinking about that empathy or that ethical design, to me, that is, like, the biggest thing we can employ moving from where we are today, going into this metaverse of the future. But, Letha.
Yeah. I want to take it in a slightly different direction. I love what you said about the curation of your reality, and working in security, privacy, anti-abuse. One of the topics that comes up a lot is misinformation, but also just the splitting of information. Having these.
What do you mean by splitting, though? I don't.
Yeah, so what I mean is, like your headless browsers, each one of us is getting a different lens on the world. That's always
Right.
been the case. My lens on the world growing up was undoubtedly very different from yours, probably very different from each of yours, but the way in which it happens now is no longer constrained by geography. It's constrained by the platform you're on. It's constrained by whatever algorithms are curating the experience that you're having. And I think we have an opportunity that we did not have in the physical world to be mindful about making sure that people can see that there are other perspectives available to them. That was always the holdback in the real world, is that if you live in a place, you see the perspective of that place. And we thought that moving online would take care of that. It does not. We simply have information overload. And so as we curate reality for people in the same way that we've always done, we have the opportunity to curate it in ways that show people that there is more to reality than what they're seeing. I think that's the piece that's lacking today, and I think that's the piece that gets really interesting in the metaverse. I want to be able to walk into the metaverse. I want to look at Darren, and I want to see that what he is experiencing in this moment, even though we look like we're in the same space, is not the same view of that space.
So who should be responsible for making sure these things happen? There's the companies that are building these platforms if they build them, but there's also government regulation. And if we're talking about systems that aren't necessarily commercial, if it's you and a friend setting up a digital space to hang out together, who is making the rules for these systems?
I think that's one of the challenges of a decentralized system, and I think, as always, there's this interplay between governments who are going to have to supply regulations and guardrails. That is their job in my viewpoint. But it's also on society to say, this is what we expect of the metaverse, and we are not interested in using something that does not meet these standards. And there's also, like I said, a role for NGOs. I think there's a role for companies, but I think you have to think about who is going to own the consequences of choices in the metaverse, and the answer is society is. So you have to take ownership of it, and you have to push on the NGOs, the companies, the governments to say, this is what I expect.
No, I was just gonna say the balance to that is the diversity, like being able to have all of these. If we have high engagement and high participation that can hold accountable or raise to the top, positive NGOs and other policy firms that can like really look at this, I think that's where you'll see a balance. It will become imbalanced severely if we have like participation from just like one perspective that is incentivized to corrupt the system. So I think it's really exciting, and not to harp on accessibility, but I loved your point earlier, like it's such a big, important piece of this when we think about the intentional design of like how are we able to get the most amount of people to incorporate their perspective in what we build.
Well, I know who it isn't going to be, probably, at the risk of offending any programmers in the room. Developer, yeah, you and me too. But generally, there's an old joke that a programmer is someone who solves a problem that you didn't know you had in a way that you don't understand. And certainly that's something that we want to avoid. But you said rules, and yes, there will be governance and there will be guide rails. That's something that Alith and I have in common, is we worked with a number of collaborators in the past around how to make AI safe and bring guardrails. That was an exploding technology that's enabling wonderful new things, and yet some of our colleagues, and you as well, discovered that there are implicit problems, and that at its foundation it was fundamentally broken. And just calling that out was enough for our governments to actually make better legislation and policy around it, but for technologists to also be aware of it. And I think we're doing the same thing in the metaverse, hopefully. We want to sit there and think about what kind of awareness we can bring to these things, just calling out labels, like you said, and giving people an awareness that maybe something's different or that you're seeing it differently is enough to, I think, engage our critical reasoning, that which makes us most human, our ability to examine the world, maybe unbiased, maybe biased, and give it unconventional inquiry, and then really explore. I mean, the metaverse is going to be great, but it's never going to be as great as what happens already in between our ears. And then what we can do, if we can really harness that, I think we can come up with, and I have complete faith in this group and all around the world, these creators, that can create tools that are going to help us, right? And you said this. I love what you said earlier about the fact that in the physical world, we didn't have that ability so easily, all right? We could have signs everywhere there are signs. Or in this world, maybe we can just do that when we need it. You have on-demand ability to have like X-ray vision in the metaverse, so you can see things more clearly in a way that helps you, hopefully, in a way that helps unite people, in a way that helps create empathy. I was so concerned initially that the metaverse would create disparate realities and filter bubbles. But what I'm hearing through our discussions more and more is that it also has the opportunity to create shared empathy, for someone to really step inside someone else's shoes. I saw something in the World Economic Forum a few years ago. I can't attribute it correctly because I don't remember. I think it was a university group or a tech startup or both that was creating augmented reality so that policymakers at the World Economic Forum, so that statesmen and stateswomen, could try to experience what the wars looked like, right? They could try to experience what it would be like to live in that, and do it from different viewpoints, whether as a child, whether as an adult, whether on one side or another side. And so who is going to create these kind of, I'm going to use your term from our earlier conversation, these empathy machines? That is a huge opportunity for humanity, I think. I love the idea of doing that. And there's no rules involved in that. Let's just do it and try to think, is it going to be good for people?
I mean, how do you feel like you do that while still being clear that while you can put on a headset and experience something from this place, you're not doing that. You're not actually having that experience. There was a similar forum where people could put on headsets and experience sort of being unhoused, but you clearly do not have that experience.
No.
How do you make sure that that's clear? And how do you create spaces for people who maybe are actually in war-torn areas or who are actually living outside?
Yeah. Well, the question itself, begs just like expectation setting. A lot of the work that we do, whether it be in the metaverse or leading up to the metaverse, is to spark conversation and to understanding and to dialogue across differences. So it may not be a one-for-one experience that plays out and resonates for the rest of your life, but to me, if the expectation set that it starts a conversation from a place of empathy, I think that's a win.
Yeah, I think the people that should be making those decisions are the people who are having those experiences. I think if you want to do it in a way that's thoughtful, that builds empathy, then those are the people who should be starting that conversation. You really want to give them the opportunity to tell their story rather than telling it for them.
And by the way, you can preserve that story. You can, to a point on archival, you can create experiences such that we can learn from others in a more immersive way over time. I mean, we can all probably remember a book that was, or a movie, or a piece of art, or a piece of music that created almost who we are, our identities and our belief systems. I can right now just think of books that I've read as a child that helped me understand the world. Imagine if we can do that better. Imagine if we could do more of that through technology. How can we use technology as an accelerator for the good, but also be very candid that if we do it incorrectly, we're beta testing on a young generation, which I don't want to have my kids be the beta generation for all this stuff. Because technology is moving. The other big thing that's happened in the world is technology is moving so quickly, and that's amazing. But never in human history has there been so much happening all over the world all at once. And so how do we harness all the good and keep some of the other stuff from happening?
Now, really quickly, the points that you just
But
made.
not shoot ourselves in the foot, too.
Right, preserving history, preserving someone's story, the ownership of that story and the credibility. Yeah. It reminds me of something that I'm experiencing right now, just in digital life, where I'm a huge fan of De La Soul, one of my favorite all-time hip-hop groups, and they didn't own the rights to their music for quite some time. And once that happened and everyone went to streaming, there were huge audiences that were missing out on their music. And it was something that I found really shocking, but also really speaks to your point, Aletha, that when we think about who owns that story and how do we know what we're missing and not seeing, being able to bring that historical archive, those stories that are authentic and incredible into the metaverse is another point that I implore all of us to be able to work on and design together.
Yeah, I actually started my career working in the archival storage field, oddly enough. I had a very long journey to where I am today. And one of the conversations that we had was around how do you fund the archival of content? Who pays for it? Who pays for the storage? Who pays for the electricity? How do you make sure that these critical cultural artifacts aren't lost? Because if you leave it up to a company who justifiably has a profit model, at some point it becomes not worth moving De La Soul's catalog into the streaming service.
I can see the progression of human history here, though. It's going to be if a tree fell in a forest and no one was around to hear it, did it really happen? Now it's going to be if it wasn't on YouTube, it didn't really happen. Now it's going to be if someone doesn't make an NFT of this, did it really ever happen in the metaverse?
That actually raises a good question because we were talking about ownership before.
A little too long for a bumper sticker, but yeah.
So how do you balance the interests of preserving something and making it available for history and making sure that the artist involved still has this feeling that they have control over their work and that they can make money off it?
Oh, yes, I know. So for me, those are the parts that get me excited about blockchain and being able to describe it. I know it's got its issues and problems, but if there is a world where we can bring those two worlds together, where attribution, provenance, all of those pieces can stay true, I think that's a big step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think the thing that's challenging about blockchain as it stands today is that it tells you that something exists, but not what it was. You can talk about the ownership chain, but the content itself can be lost to history, and you just have this dangling link. So.
Yeah, it's weird, because it reminds me a little bit, if you go back in time, do you remember when you used to actually, some of you guys might be too young to remember this, do you remember when you used to have to save things? Like you would like be writing like a paper for school, and like if you didn't remember to save it, it just like disappeared. And that was a limitation of the hardware, right? The hardware at the time was scarcity. It was a mindset of the designers of scarce resources. So then we made an entire design decision around this mentality of scarcity that we had to explicitly save everything, and if you didn't do that, it disappeared. It's as if it didn't happen, right? And then we had this explosion in storage and an abundance of things. And we're getting there too with network bandwidth. And so the design decision switched to, of course, what do you have to do now? Nobody explicitly saves anything. We went from like explicit save to auto save to like everything will be around forever, which has its own set of problems and benefits. But it's interesting to see how these like physical things, these hardware limitations, and abundance versus scarcity, these mindsets that have been around forever, then change our entire worlds that we're creating. So I think that'll be interesting as well, how we look at that.
So I'm going to open things up to questions soon in, I think, about 5 minutes or so. So we're going to have room for maybe one last question, which is, say you don't want to live in the metaverse. How much should you be able to opt out of these things? How much should you be able to disengage if you decide that's what you want?
I think the challenge with the metaverse is the same challenge that we have faced with social media, that we have faced with membership in everything before that. It's that you have the opportunity to opt out, but you don't get to reap the benefits of it. So I am not on Facebook. There are a lot of parties that I miss. Many invitations go to my spam box because I'm not on Facebook. I think what we'll see is that people will experience a social pressure to join regardless of whatever commercial pressures they experience, and so people will wind up migrating whether they want to or not.
Yeah, no, I think it's something we have to be incredibly mindful of. This question is difficult for the sense that I think if the movement towards the metaverse, as you had said, Aletha, is so strong that you actually miss out on opportunities, you miss out on participation. Dare I say, you miss out on like civil liberties and rights because decisions are being made for you in the metaverse. I think that's something that we have to be really mindful of as we design it to have, as I was mentioning earlier, these off-ramps that are healthy and safe and allow people to have a visibility of what's happening there, but also exist in the real world.
So I think we've seen the same thing happen before with just internet access or device access, right? And we've had big movements before, like a PC for every child, and trying to make these on-ramps more accessible. And I think the same problems and same opportunities might happen with the metaverse, except for that it'll be a bigger fire because it has a little bit more gas on it at this point. Instead, what I would focus on maybe is what are the golden principles by which we want to look at these kind of technologies and these experiences. And I think one we can learn from medicine, which is the benefits should accrue to those that are participating, yes, but also you shouldn't be excluded. So if I go to the hospital and they find something about me that's going to be beneficial to other people, then hopefully I benefit from the scientists and doctors that are studying me, and other people benefit too. But if someone refuses to participate in those kind of studies, they should still also benefit. And so I don't know how to do that, but I think it would be an interesting way to think about where do we philosophically want to draw those lines. We already had a lot of these discussions around vaccination. We've had a lot of these discussions around other social topics that have come up. And I think we need to take a big step back and think just, okay, as humans first, how do we want this all to unfold, regardless of really the specific canonical technology or advancement that we're looking at?
I think what's important is whether you're externalizing the costs or the benefits. I think the place where we as a society make choices is when we start to externalize costs onto others. We say, now you're imposing on society. I really feel very strongly about people's ability to be fluid in their choices over time, to be able to opt in, to opt out, to say, I want to participate at this level, not at this level.
That's funny. I think if I opt in and opt out of Facebook right now, I don't know if I exist and don't exist. It's a little awkward.
One encore question, actually, I lied before, which is if there was one question that you wanted people to walk out of here thinking about with the metaverse, what would it be? Something pretty succinct. Like Taj, let's talk.
How do we get communities ready to participate in the metaverse beyond just the headset? So this idea of like policy ready, data ready, credibility ready, like this awareness of what it is, how they engage it, and what are the safety mechanisms that we can employ to really have a design that's intentional to keep their ideas, thoughts, and creations safe.
I love what you said, Taj. I think for me, much along the same lines, what I would love for people to come away from this with is the idea that we need to help people to understand their experiences online better. We need to help them build intuitions. And so as we're enabling the metaverse, we want to build interfaces, technologies that help them understand what's happening, to be transparent with how they're experiencing the world, what's happening with their information. So clarity, transparency, intuition.
Well said. I think I would just want to ask all of us, as we look at the internet and the history of ourselves participating in it and our children participating in it, I tended to focus a lot of my career on content filtration. I think what's going to happen, right, so how can I redact certain things, not show certain things that are not age appropriate as a parent that I deem, right? I'm curating an environment for my daughter as part of her education and upbringing, and that's going to be different for everybody. I think in the metaverse, I might have to change my mind a little bit. Instead of content filtration, it might be more about how to have more content sharing. Because through content sharing, if done well, so instead of keeping things away, by sharing more, I think we can create better bridges between people and maybe get a lot of the social goodness that we're hoping for. That would be my hope. I don't know exactly how to do it yet. And so that's why I really wanted to have this panel. I wanted to get the message out to all of you who can help us create those ideas, right? How can you help someone out there in the audience, someone out there in the world is going to help us create these things? And I think instead of going from filtration, if we go towards sharing, I think there's only going to be goodness in that. There'll be some roadblocks, but and some bumpy roads, but there
You
could be
can
goodness
corner
at
them
the end.
after this and ask about their favorite Roblox worlds.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a microphone that's going to get passed around. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to direct. Gray shirt, third row. There will be a microphone, and mine is going to get temporarily cut off.
Until you get that microphone, it's pretty awesome that you guys are all here, and thanks for having questions. Really appreciate you guys being here.
I think I can start without a microphone, maybe, but I can also use the microphone. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the different perspectives. I'd love to hear you comment a little bit more on something that you, Alethea, actually rightfully pointed out, which is that a lot of the expectations and the narrative of Web 2 were very similar to democratization, inclusive participation, content creator empowerment. What should make me believe that the metaverse in conjunction with Web 3 will be any more able to fulfill these expectations? Why is this not just all hype?
Oh, yeah. Did you want Alethea to answer that? Sorry. All of us.
Okay. I guess since I kicked it off, I'll start there, and then I will let Darren and Taj weigh in as well. I think the fundamental things that drove Web 2.0 to be what it was were the fundamental forces that are going to work against Web 3. You have companies that still need to make a profit. You have frictions to entry. You have people who can't get online. You have people who can't create. And you have an overwhelming surfeit of content. That was really what we learned as we went into Web 2.0, is that there was too much information. And so curators became the new gatekeepers in a way that we did not expect. So in Web 3, we're going to have the same issues. It all comes down to people. You will have exactly the same problems you have always had, and the question is, how are you distributing the power around those problems? So who are going to be those curators? How are you going to understand who is curating and why? And how do you make sure that people not only can create content, but that that content is not erased because they can't get through the gatekeepers?
Yeah. And just to add to that, like, I really appreciate the skepticism there, and a lot of that I feel, like, as a designer, largely because it's an evolution. Like, where we are today is where we're going, and if we don't stop in certain key moments and take a beat to look at what we've learned from where we are and employ them, I think that's huge. And I think before where we may be passively waiting for a platform to be delivered to us, I think when that happens, or if we create our own platforms, we should really think about the intentionality of the design. Are we focusing on the negative sentiment versus the positive sentiment? Are we raising through algorithms different voices and ideas? Are we bringing equity? And I think all of that is through having access. Like if we can have innovation where more people have the ability to participate, which is very similar to the digital divide that still continues, but if we can like really focus on that, I think that's where all of our innovation will be birthed.
Yeah, and actually I want to,
We should be pretty short with this because I want to get at least one more question.
Yeah, sure.
absolutely. I just
Oh
want
yeah, then don't go to me. I was going to talk about something very Go, Lisa.
Addie asked me what I wanted people to take away from the panel, and I realized there's one point that I missed, which is that I don't want you to be passive observers to the development of the metaverse. I would love to see all of you walk out of here and say, this is what I want to see.
Yes.
Because that is how we wind up with the metaverse that we want, rather than the metaverse that
All right,
we...
that will be my point. It's just
not
the
advocate
technology
against.
exists for all of you to take control of that future.
Black shirt, red mask, I think again, row 3, very hard for me to count.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a startup entrepreneur from Berlin, and we all are stressing how great it is that we're all in this room together, that South by Southwest is finally taking place again, that it's not only online. And now listening to you guys, or listening to you saying, oh, we all remember the books we read as kids, but let's now reinvent it in the metaverse, but better. I'm wondering, isn't it great to have these human interactions? And it's a very German question because we still love to play in the woods and kind of want our kids to have childhoods like we had. But isn't there a threat that we too early say, let's all engage into this metaverse, let's get our kids online, let's try to invent their childhood in a different way, and kind of neglecting that it's actually pretty great to not only be in a digital world?
Yeah, I think the world is great as it is, and we can add this as just another thing. One of the things that really inspires me is one of my neighbors has cerebral palsy, and he is non-ambulatory, non-vocal. And so the metaverse is a way for him to participate in experiences and life experiences that I think would be otherwise maybe more difficult. And that's an extreme example, but that's why I used the other one earlier about maybe I'm 100 years old and I still want to experience new things, or I want to experience what it's like to be on the other side of the world. I don't look at it as a replacement. I look at it as a supplement, and I look at it as something that can be harnessed potentially for great good, depending on all things. COVID showed us that sometimes we don't have the option to go outside, depending on where we were, and this is just one more tool. Do I want to spend all my time there? I don't know. It depends what it is, and we'll see. I don't know if that helps answer, but I'd love to turn it over to some other panelists.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue, I think, to what I was saying earlier about things like geography constraining your experiences. There are kids who can't go outside and play in the woods for whatever reason. They live in the middle of a dense urban environment. They are physically disabled. So you have the opportunity to give people enriched experiences. They can take classes from the best professors in the world, no matter where they're located. I think I hear your point about wanting people to go outside and play. I absolutely push my daughter regularly to get off her screen and go have a real world experience. I think it's really good for them, but I also think you can enrich those real world experiences with things they would otherwise never have access to.
Yeah. Plus one to that, like I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Like they can both exist. But I know there's some other questions. We got one more?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have one more. Fingerless gloves. That
Yeah. Nice.
and this will, I think, be our last question.
As I have watched from the outside the progression of what now we call the metaverse, I've watched a lot of people fall by the wayside. I still have an aunt that's looking for a bookstore, okay? And to try to explain to her and work with her, it isn't the same thing. And so how do we keep and yet I'll go back to my grandchild, and he could buy a book and have it read before she could even get to the bookstore or find one. So how do we keep people from falling off the ramp as we go along? And we think, oh, it's just great. I have an aunt that won't do, always has to go to a doctor, won't do it over Zoom. And I've done it many times. So how do we keep people from falling off? Because now her doctor won't even see her in person. So how do we do this?
So I was just going to jump in and say, I love the metaphor that Taj uses, which is called on-ramps. I don't know that we've always done a great job of having the best on-ramps, whether it's the design of a hardware mouse or a QWERTY keyboard or all these other things. I think this is a huge opportunity this time. I'm always optimistic that we can maybe engage a more diverse set of people. That was my joke about the programmers, not letting us just design it, but getting more diverse people. And never before has that been easier because of things like the metaverse and social media to connect with other disparate folks who can bring different design decisions and help create many on-ramps with low friction. That's what I would hope for.
Just to add to that, in a previous life, I would open up after-school programs across the U.S. to improve literacy abilities, and it was a real focus not only of like government agencies, but NGOs, nonprofits. I think that focus needs to continue, but not just in terms of the engagement, but also the design. As you were saying, Darren, like when we think about these communities and these spaces that we want to build and create, it will be better when everyone's able to actively participate, not just in like the passive piece, but in terms of like what they look like in the design. So I would love for us to also focus on that as much when we talk about the metaverse. So it's a great question.
Can I just say one thing since I see folks leaving? We have a lounge, so we can take, I'm going to be there afterwards, and I think some of you guys can join us.
Yeah.
We can keep on taking questions in that lounge. It's on this floor. It's called the Bright Side Lounge, and there's, I think, beverages there and food and stuff like that, too. I don't overpromise, but yeah.
Great, yeah, and I think that's how we should wrap it up.
Oh, okay.
It was fantastic having you all. These were very, very good questions from the audience.
Thanks for being so engaged.
We're right at the beginning of South by.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.